And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of a film.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
All right, man. Well, let's get into it. By the way, welcome back. And, thanks for coming back on. I appreciate you being generous with your time.
Absolutely. Nice to hear from you, Josh.
So, did I understand correctly that I saw that you went down to Contact in the Desert not too long ago and gave a presentation down there?
Actually, that was in 2018.
Oh, okay.
My co-author, Hugh Newman, was there this year. I was there in 2018. I gave several talks about Edgar Cayce and kind of the, I'm into comparative analysis to solve problems in the universe of time and space, and I rely heavily on the mystics like Edgar Cayce, Rudolf Steiner, Blavatsky, the Rosicrucians in Freemason literature, Plato, Herodotus, the great chroniclers, religious documents, oral traditions, and I kind of shake all the fragments together, and basically they all say the same thing about the past in the same strange and specific way that centers around Atlantis and floods and androgynous created gods, all these strange and specific notions about the past that could not have been conjured independently by all these different sources. So as a historical detective, it really catches my imagination.
Yeah, okay. So you were there in 2018, and Hugh was there this year. That makes sense. I thought I saw something on your Facebook page, but Hugh's your co-author, so it makes sense then that he was there. But you did spend some time with Hugh over in Europe recently doing some research over there, right?
Yeah, we were just out in California. We did some talks in Irvine, and we went to Catalina Island to do some research about an ancient stone circle on Catalina Island that was reported by the early Spanish explorers that the native people there had built. And we're doing some giant research follow-up at the Ralph Glidden Museum, and Hugh and I spent a lot of time roaming around the British Isles and other places. We actually go everywhere. We're going to Egypt and Jordan in November, and Hugh's a good co-author, and he's a megalithomania freak with an open mind, so he's really good to work with. He's very bright, that's a good thing too. He's open-minded and intelligent.
Yeah. Well, last time you and I spoke, we dove pretty deep into the giants and then kind of ancient origins around, like the Clovis peoples, and we talked about the Denisovans and things like that, kind of around origins, which I do want to talk a little bit about more again, because I know that's one of your areas of expertise. But you just mentioned your work around Edgar Cayce, and that's one thing that we didn't really dive into last time, but I know based on just talks I've heard you give elsewhere, that's something that you also are very knowledgeable about. And I'm not. Like, I know about Edgar Cayce, and I know some of the predictions and prophecies he had and kind of his methodology for, the visions and the types of sessions that he held. But that's really it. Like, I don't really know the depth or the breadth of his work. So I kind of wanted to spend some time there and see how that kind of ties into the other mysticism of the time, and, how some of those predictions that he made, for one, what you think about it, and two, how you think it ties into some of these other themes like, Atlantis and, giant myths and things like that. So anything you want to say to kind of kick us off into that Edgar Cayce direction, I'd like to dive down that rabbit hole a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Edgar Cayce was a Christian mystic born in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, I believe in 1877. And he was a very humble, pious, religious man. He went into a trance-like state. Well, one thing was, like, when he had this gift when he was younger, his father would give him a bunch of shit for not doing his homework, so he took a book and he slept on the book for 20 minutes, and then he said to his father, "Ask me anything from any page of that book and I could tell you." And the father was flabbergasted, thought he was screwing with him, and he did that, and he tested him, and he realized that his son had this incredible ability, and Cayce only had an 8th grade education, and he ended up going into a trance-like state and basically being a channel, a trance channel, where the majority of his readings over 14,025 million words, which is housed, his documents are housed at the ARE Library in Virginia Beach, Virginia. They were mostly on health issues, and he's the father of holistic health. But within his trance-like state, he started to talk about past lives, and he started to talk about Atlantis and Lemuria, the lost continent in the Pacific, and he gave very specific timelines. And he was a conservative Christian, so he was kind of taken back, and because Christians don't believe in reincarnation, at least not the esoteric ones do, but not the mainstream Christians. And Atlantis and these wild ideas really kind of threw him for a loop, but he stuck with it, and they kept asking more questions. And he basically said that about 210,000 BC, in the middle of the Atlantic, soul beings descended into matter and got trapped in matter and became, a race of people who later were to create Homo sapiens, and that they were, the first beings were considered androgynous, which is strange, like sexless beings that procreated through the way an amoeba does. And you say, oh, that's a wild idea, that's insane. But Plato specifically talks about our first state was androgynous, the Rosicrucians and Freemasons do, the Theosophists. The entire world is littered with androgynous gods and amphibious gods with these strange man-bags who show up after the flood and restart civilization, like Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan. They're all androgynous in South and Central America. Oannes, the weird fish guy who shows up in Sumeria, he is specifically known to be androgynous. Fuxi in China, who teaches the I Ching and advanced geometry and mathematics, androgynous. And there's a double-headed male and female androgynous relief in tombs. So I don't want to get long-winded, but it is chronicled everywhere. And Casey talks about giants and little people being part of the population of Atlantis, and that it was eventually destroyed 12,900 years ago. Now, we know that there was an event, a flood and a cataclysm called the Younger Dryas Impact Event that hit 12,900 years ago. So science has verified what oral traditions, the mystics, and religious documents have told us. So Casey made some predictions about the future that didn't come true, like a pole shift in 1996 and other things. But he even said himself, you can't read the future because there's too many variables. But as he peered through the past, he was remarkably accurate, just like all these other mystical sources that are painting a picture of the past. And like I said, through comparative analysis, you get this strange and specific understanding of what the past was all about.
So what do you think the representation of these androgynous deities, what's the origin of that or the purpose behind it? Do you think these are actual entities, or do you think this is some sort of metaphorical representation of the masculine and feminine energy or something like that? What do you think that is at its core?
That's a great question. And it is, known that we have devolved into male and female aspects as we're kind of trapped in matter in the universe and time and space. And our original state was androgynous. And there's a lot of spiritual people think it's a metaphor. But it's a metaphor and it's a reality that these beings are, another thing is that the human species seems to be genetically engineered by extraterrestrials. I used to scoff at the idea. I know what it's like to be an asshole skeptic, so I'm not going to denigrate anyone because I used to run my mouth and say that's a crazy idea. But through the back door, I've come to realize all these androgynous gods show up around the world teaching complex mathematics, geometry. They're all depicted usually as amphibious beings with fish tails and fish bodies, and they carry these man bags. And this is all around the world. And then you go to the Dogon people in Mali, Africa, where in the 30s, Olga Matelli, the Dogon blind elder, shared with two French anthropologists the knowledge of the Dogon people to them. And they said that the Nomo, amphibious, androgynous beings who taught them all the knowledge were from Sirius. And that the man bags they carry around are somehow grounding these beings when they showed up here into the atmosphere of the Earth. Now, that sounds all wild, but this isolated African tribe is saying that these amphibious beings are real. They're androgynous, hermaphroditic, and then you go to Mexico, then you go to Sumeria, you go to China, Siberia, all around the world, it's the same story. Australian Aboriginals have the same gods, and the Zuni Indians, just like so many native tribes, they have a belief in the two-spirit beings having this incredible power. They, in fact, sent a man dressed as a woman who was this incredible shaman to Washington, D.C. in the 1880s, who was taken in at the White House, and they thought he was a princess, basically, because he was basically a two-spirit person. And the ancient cultures, the non-Christian cultures, respected, especially the native ones, like gay and lesbian and transgender people, because they embodied the two aspects of male and female, and they had more spiritual power. And they would give the warriors names and things like that. And then Columbus showed up, and he killed many homosexuals. And when he showed up in the Americas and stuff, so it's that kind of hardcore conservative Christian, anti-gay and lesbian orientation that is, got us stuck where we are now with this weird relationship with these ideas of being gay and transgender and things like that.
Well, I never heard that about Columbus. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I'm no lover of Columbus and the Spanish explorers, but I never heard about him intentionally targeting sexual minorities like homosexuals. But wow, that's wild.
He was a piece of shit. Yeah,
he was a piece of shit. There's no doubt about that. I can't believe Columbus Day is still a thing. Just to go on a tangent, can you believe that people still get that as a paid holiday, man? Like that's crazy. Like we know that the Scandinavians were here before him. It's nuts. And he didn't even discover America. The guy landed in the Caribbean, never touched foot on the mainland. But anyway, these man bags that you're talking about. Could it have just been some sort of like metrosexual fashion of the time, or is there some like spiritual significance to these? I've never seen them in these reliefs or paintings or any ancient artifacts, but I'm sure they're there, right?
Oh, no, they're all around the world. The oldest representation of Quetzalcoatl.
Yeah, I'm looking right now.
La Venta site of the Olmeca world, right? Yeah, look up man bags. They're everywhere. Quetzalcoatl, he has a man bag. He's androgynous, and he has a fishtail. Oannes, the fish freak who shows up, he sleeps in the river at night, and he teaches the Sumerians, like, complex mathematics. Yeah. He has a man bag. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the oldest temple site on the planet, 50 times larger than Stonehenge, 12,000 years old. Pillar 43 has 3 man bags on top of it. The oldest statues in the world have androgyny and polydactylism, 6 fingers and 6 toes, burned into the reliefs. So, and even academics have written about this. Eric Ziffer, 2007, Israeli Exploration Journal, wrote an article, an academic paper called Ayin Ghazal Busts the Original Adam in Ancient Androgyny, where he says that these are basically the mythological creator gods of humanity that had 6 fingers and 6 toes, much like the giant of Gath in the Bible, 2120, 6 fingers, 6 toes, and were androgynous beings, like all the sources around the planet are saying. So, like, I'm a freak with like 50 tabs over my computer, and it's not like, oh, I cooked this shit up. There are so many, there's a mountain of sources that talk about androgyny, polydet man bag hybrids, Atlantis, and all the sources that I have indicated, including some of the greatest chronicles in human history, all give the same telling of the past in the same strange and specific way. Yeah. So it's the greatest coincidence in the history of man, or there's a reality to it.
Yeah, I'll be damned. You're not kidding me. I'm looking right now. It's funny because one of the headlines of this article I'm looking at, were ancient deities fashionable? And it says mysterious handbags spotted in ancient sculptures around the world. But as you scroll through, it talks about the Assyrians, the Babylonians. It's got representations of the Anunnaki. And now that I'm looking at it, I actually have seen some of these pictures. I guess I just didn't put 2 and 2 together before. But yeah, it's crazy from Latin America to South America to the ancient Mesopotamian cultures. I mean, they're all holding these little handbags. It looks like something that would have like incense in it or something. I don't know. It's weird, and it looks like they're all like doing this like pinching gesture with the other hand, like they're pinching something like out of the bag.
Yes, and they got pine cones oftentimes, and the mystical teachings of these beings were like these high principled, non-dualistic teachings about the nature of time and space. So it's represented by the seven-headed serpent, which you find all around the world once again. And that's what I get into with the KC material. I'm a non-dualist. I study Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta, Jesus, Buddha. The greatest spiritual teachers in human history all say the same thing about the nature of time and space. That lines up perfectly with quantum entanglement and quantum theory that science is now revealing to us. So all the mystical traditions have been proven to be accurate. And to me, that's the most important thing about ancient mysteries. It's just a cool story if it's going nowhere. If it doesn't help you understand what you are, why you're here in time and space, what your true nature is, it's just a good story. And, I like a good story, but it gets boring after a while unless there's some reproducible thought system that you can incorporate in your life to kind of free yourself from misperceptions about what you are and the nature of this place.
So the common origin point, and you and I talked about this beforehand. I want to get back to Casey in a second, but I mean, if the Sumerians have this representation of their deities, the Latin American cultures, Aztecs, Mayans, people who were in the Americas at that time, if they're all representing these deities in that type of fashion, what's the origin point from your opinion? Is this because these quote-unquote deities or peoples visited them all across the world, or is it because the common thread is that these cultures all came from the same place and, basically had the same encounter with these entities or the same mythology?
If you listen to all the mystics and the oral traditions of all the peoples and all the lands that they landed in across the world, they'll tell you the same story. A lost continent in the middle of the Atlantic was submerged 12,000 years ago, and gradually over the next couple thousand years, these beings showed up and restarted a devastated global civilization. And they taught basically the same thing: the arts of civilization, complex geometry, megalithic building. Like the most outrageous megalithic sites are littered all around the planet, and they're exceedingly old. And the thing about these beings is they are represented with 6 fingers and 6 toes oftentimes. They are androgynous. They are fish gods. They are, they have all these bizarre traits, and they carry man bags, and they show up all around the world teaching, like, once again, sophisticated and advanced math and geometry and civilization. So it's well beyond coincidence that these isolated regions that didn't have any contact would conjure the same culture heroes and creator gods. Yep. They specifically state that these beings showed up. They were sometimes giant. They were described as supernatural. So Casey said these beings were part of the population of Atlantis, and they were benevolently oriented, although there were some very malevolent beings in Atlantis also that survived and, like Baal, and showed up at Baalbek, Lebanon, and other sites. But you have the spreading of knowledge after this great flood, so a repromulgation of society, just like Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch and Andrew Collins talk about after the great flood.
Yeah, so that's the direction I was kind of trying to take this, is where they came from. The consensus then with the mystics is that these guys came from Atlantis or some ancient advanced society that's no longer here, and they reinvigorated society after the cataclysm known as the flood in many cultures, or coming out of an ice age, whatever it may have been that turned society on its head or basically set us back to that version of the Stone Age. These guys came back and basically opened the door to the next chapter of wisdom and advancement. So were they gods? Were they another race that evolved naturally, on this planet from a bygone era, and they're the remnants of the advanced civilization of Atlantis, or are they from off this planet?
Yes, another good question. They are portrayed as both, quite frankly. I think there was, with the Dogon angle and the oral traditions of these other people, it seems like definitely that Homo sapiens were a creation of an extraterrestrial species. You don't have to be in a Zecharia Sitchin to understand that through reading the Akkadian, the Sumerian texts. Mm-hmm. It shows up everywhere around the world. And it's just one of these things that you either believe it or you don't at this point. I'm not going to push my opinion. I used to not believe it. I thoroughly believe it. In another matter, not because I saw UFOs everywhere, because of studying ancient wisdom and techniques and esoteric sources. So you have our original state was androgynous, and that is probably extraterrestrial and androgynous, and then we devolved into male and female, or we were created by beings who had more spiritual power than we did at the time. I mean, we are everything in time and space because it's holographic, but as beings that are incarnating in a human form, we're kind of like our third eye is closed, the pineal gland is kind of not like it used to be. We're kind of trapped in a materialistic weird culture that's always looking outside itself to get a hit or whatever. So some would say you can get a lot of work done when times are tough and you're in a tough mortal shell. But whatever the case, these beings are looked at as gods, but they are just us in a different iteration, I would say. But there is interaction of extraterrestrials in and out of this plane of existence for eons. No question about that. I take that to the bank.
So UFOs have been kind of a theme on my podcast recently, and I want to get your perspective on this. You kind of just alluded to seeing UFOs in the past, but so my view, if it's not obvious already for those who listen to the podcast, is definitely that there was some sort of visitation in the past, and it probably did have something to do with the origins of man appearing on the earth. But there's way too many parallels among different societies and cultures in terms of the Anunnaki. I think that literally means like those who came from the heavens to the earth. And then you've got the Enoch story, or the Genesis story of the Bible, where it says these fallen angels came and taught men and women all these secrets about medicine and how to fire, and the Prometheus myth and all that, and all sorts of stuff. So it seems like there's definitely some sort of visitation that took place. But my question would be, in that vein, with all the UFO sightings we've had over the last century and a half, where are we now? Is that the same sort of phenomena, or is that different? Because the big debate with UFOs is this just black ops technology that the governments have developed and are keeping secret, or is this something that they gained access to either through aliens or extra dimensional beings they were in communication with? How do you think the two relate?
Yeah, it's a good analogy would be like crop circles. We've known about them since reading German woodcuts in the 1500s, but a couple drunken losers claim to have been creating them in the 80s in some place in England. But we know that there is a lot of man-made ones with different characteristics, that weren't man-made. And just like the UFO sightings, I'm sure it's government technology mixed with other natural phenomena, but we've known about, and we've had forever. In the Bible, Ezekiel has an extraterrestrial encounter. Even Edgar Cayce says that Ezekiel is talking about seeing an alien ship. Now, Cayce said that in this trance-like state. Basically, it's just operant conditioning. We just hear these themes about, like, science is a materialist. Science has become an atheistic cult. And I have a lot of friends who are scientists, and I'm not trying to diss them, but there is no room for the spiritual, the metaphysical, and the sciences. They're very hostile to these ideas, and it's just crazy, and it's bad science, because quantum mechanics, informs of the spiritual and the metaphysical realities and the power of the mind and everything. I just find that like human evolution could not have taken place the way we think. Like the development of the brain should have taken like 2.6 million years. But what happens is, like, evolution comes out. It's an elegant theory. It seems to answer all the questions. Then science reveals something like, well, wait a second. The human brain, it should have taken like 2.6 million years to get to the state it's in. And then somebody comes in with a bridge theory just to keep the evolutionary theory going that really doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Just like plate tectonics, when you really evaluate it, it is not a coherent theory that's going to last. So you have this over and over again, these kind of these theories that take hold and then they just persist because of habit and agenda. And the same thing with the extraterrestrial question. It's just glaringly apparent if you don't have an agenda that it's a reality. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable position to take. Yeah,
I would agree with you completely on that. And as far as brain development, I would argue that even 2.6 million years wouldn't be enough. I mean, you put a bowl of soup on a table and let it sit there for 2.6 million years, it's not going to become a brain, in my opinion. I mean, it's way too advanced, way too complex. The neurons that are firing, I mean, the the advanced, intricate nature of how the human brain works, and not even just the brain, but how all of our biological systems work together. You know, you look into somebody's eye and you see how complex the human eye is. I mean, I don't see how any of that could have happened, no matter how much time you give it, without some sort of intelligent intervention.
Agreed. And all the universe does is produce life. It's like grass grown through concrete in an abandoned ghost city in China or something. You know, that's all that life is everywhere. It's in thermal vents with no light at the bottom of the ocean where life wasn't supposed to exist. So there's probably life on Europa and other places. But there's no question in my mind. It's just some people are on board and some people aren't, and that's fine. I just advocate, like, don't denigrate somebody's these ideas are worth talking about, because they're written up, they ring true. They're written about in esoteric sources, religious documents, oral traditions. You know, I'm a big fan of oral traditions. I sit with a lot of elders. I do a lot of ceremonies. I listen to the wisdom of different tribes in the Amazon or in the American Southwest, and they all tell these stories about the past that ring true, that are all specific and strange, and line up with what I have gleaned through comparative analysis.
So I got to tell you something, man. I don't want to lose my train of thought, because I want to go back to a question about what you said about plate tectonics. But before I do, I gotta mention this to you, because you're the guy who set me down this trail. But after last time we spoke, between now and then, I'm skipping over a whole lot of things for brevity's sake, but I had my first and my second since then plant medicine encounter. And to your point about sitting with elders and Native American, tradition, etc., I agree with you on all that, and I got a similar heart and a similar mindset with taking all that stuff seriously. But ever since I had this plant medicine encounter, it's gotten heightened to a whole new level, man. Like, I really felt like I went into like this deep spiritual place that was literally outside of my own body, like separated from my body, especially during the second experience, which I won't go into great detail on the podcast, but we could talk about it another time. But anyway, I literally saw the person I was with turn into a Native American woman right in front of me. Like, no joke. I was with somebody else when I did it, and she turned into a Native American woman with a headdress, and then I started hearing, it was like if people were standing behind a waterfall talking to each other, and I was on the other side of that waterfall, I could hear them talking, but it was like muffled by the sound of water. And it wasn't really water. It was like, the way I describe it is it's like another dimension, but there was something between us, and I used the water analogy as the barrier, but they were on the other side of that barrier, and I could hear them talking and chanting, and it was almost like they were beckoning me to this other reality. And in that moment, I knew, like, there wasn't a doubt in my mind. I knew that there was another dimension, like, within my fingertips grasp. And the plant medicine that I was on showed me that. But it was the reason I bring it up is because it was a very Native experience. Like, the whole time I was in this trance state, I was hearing Native American chants, Native American music. I was seeing Native American people, and I was having these deep spiritual encounters that all felt very primal in nature. So what do you make of that? I mean, I know you've been down that road.
Oh, absolutely. It's what the Gnostics would call gnosis, or putting your head through the veil. Because we're living one lifetime at a time, we can't get too much information overload. You couldn't experience a life if you understood all your past lives, your thousands of other lifetimes that you've lived. So what you're doing is the veil is thin in these states. It's not an erroneous hallucination. It's kind of a connection with something higher. So you oftentimes see your Aboriginal lives. You see a parade of different incarnations that you have. But when you have an affinity, which I do too, to say like native civilization, you get in there. Sometimes you see the horrors and the genocide that occurred, and I've been there too. And it's not all unicorns and rainbows. Yeah. But then you see the ceremonies and the commitment, and the like all the shaman talk about, like the journey of the heart, which is like, what the hell does that mean? But that's how oral tradition was embedded in the minds of people through the heart, which you get a fuller understanding when you partake of plant medicine, because it opens you up. You step outside the separate self. You are not over-identified with your stupid survival or your dumb personality traits. You are something larger that turns into like a supercomputer. With your intellect in a heartfelt way just goes off the charts. So the experience you have is mimicked by, thousands and thousands of other people who do it. And you're just reaching through the thin veil and seeing outside yourself and seeing all your other past lifetimes at once.
Yeah, that's exactly what it felt like. The word journey is the word I use to describe it, because it felt like I was taking on this marathon, man. It was almost like the death process, or like going through the experience of death. Like at first, like I was resisting it and fighting it, and it was a terrifying experience. And then you get sucked in, and eventually it gets to this point of acceptance. And then there's this euphoria state, and there were moments where I literally broke out laughing. I was so filled with joy and happiness. And there were other moments I was terrified and frightened, and there were moments where I was crying. But it went on for hours, and it could have been days. If you told me I had been under for days, I would have believed you. But I'd really only been gone for a few hours. But I knew the moment I left my body. I told my wife this. I felt the frequency change, and I don't know if you had the same experience. But after I started to go in, when the medicine started to hit me and take its effect, and it happened quick. It was like 20, 30 minutes after I ingested it. I felt in my brain, and I even heard it audibly. It sounded like a frequency change, like when you change a radio station, and then everything changed, like manifested. It was almost like the Matrix. Like all of reality in front of me started to have green grids on it, like you're looking at the Matrix screen with all the zeros and ones. And then it's like the code just fell away and everything disappeared and went black. And I did it in a dark room with a covering over my eyes, because the shaman that I knew told me that it should be an internal journey. He said if you have external stimulation, you're not going to focus more on the inner work. So he told me, at least for the first time, to go inward and keep my eyes closed. So I did that. And it was a trip, man. It was like a rocket ship to space. So it literally got sucked out of my body, and it was a primal native experience. But when I saw the person next to me as a Native American, that was in the flesh with my eyes open. I took the blindfold off because I was getting so far out of it that the person I was with said, take the blindfold off. Thinking it would bring me back to reality. But when I did take it off and I looked at her, she was a Native American woman wearing a headdress. So I just wanted to share that with you, because I still don't fully know what to make of that. I'm kind of just letting it come to me, but I did feel like what you just said confirmed a lot of my thoughts about it. Like it felt like I was having recollections of not things that were somebody else's experience. They were to an extent, but I felt like they were experiences that I had in the past as well. Like all these past memories and past incarnations, it almost felt like. And I still don't know where I come down and how I feel about that, and like whether or not I had past lives or whatnot. I definitely don't write it off, but I'll tell you what, this pushed me a hell of a lot closer to being confident that I did, because these things just came flooding back, and it felt like they were there all along. They were just waiting for me to remember.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. And it was more like waiting for your perceptive abilities to be able to metabolize it. Because the more you're over-identified with, oh, I'm Josh, I'm this, I'm that.
Exactly.
Oh, shit, I got to go to work, I got to pay that bill. That just keeps you entrenched in a very, very limited bandwidth, And when you meditate and you open your mind to different ideas, or you do medicine journeys or chant or do yoga, these things will open you up, and you can see transpersonally. You see all your lives. You judge less because you've played the role of a million different characters in this place. So some ancient ethnic strife, you've been on both sides of the fence, and you look at it differently. And I would just say that like all my buddies who are scientists, they're more afraid of ayahuasca than they are Atlantis. You know what I mean? Like I'm like, go do a plant medicine journey, and then come back and evaluate science through that lens.
Yeah.
Because it changes you, and you're like, holy shit, I was completely wrong about so much I thought about the nature of reality. It isn't, like I said, some erroneous hallucination. That's not true.
Yeah, that's what I say to people who are super dogmatic in their beliefs, or just completely fundamental, like really religious people too. And this will get me in trouble with some podcast listeners, but I don't care. But a lot of people in my world, like my circle, have very strongly, closely held beliefs, and they'll fight you on a drop of a dime over those beliefs. And I always think to myself, and I say to these people, like you need to have a psychedelic experience, or an experience outside of your normal consciousness, because it will, for one, it lets go of that ego and that overbearing confidence of I have all the answers, which is almost like comes across as like this self-righteousness, like just it's such a closely held faith or a belief that you think is noble and you think it's a good thing, but it's actually detrimental. It took me a lot of years to see that, but a lot of these people won't let that go. Well, that's what the plant medicine experience does for you, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have it in nature. It's like God put it there for us to experience that ego death and to realize we don't have to hold on to those things so tightly, because at the end of the day, we don't know shit. And that was the realization. And for me, man, the worst experience, not the worst, but the most profound part of the experience and emotional part was actually coming back into my body. So in one of these encounters, it was like I equate it to like putting wet clothes back on. It's like when you jump into like a lake with all your clothes on and then you take them off. Well, then you got to put those clothes back on and they're wet and soggy and it's uncomfortable. That's what it felt like coming back into my body. It was like a 30-40 minute process gradually. Like I remember being above my body and I would drop into it and I would be like, oh, I don't want to go into that. So I'd pull back out and then I'd get pulled back in. It was like a magnetically pulling me back in, to the point where I could no longer resist it eventually. And I remember coming back into my body as if I was putting wet clothes back on and just saying, I don't want to be back in this thing. Like I felt limitless. Like I felt like pure energy and form when I was outside of the body. So when I had to come back in the body, it was a negative experience. And I remember looking in the mirror after I finally got back up and went in the bathroom. I looked in the mirror at my face and it was disgusting to me. I didn't even want to look at myself. It was like, it's like it's like trading in a Ferrari for a Pinto, man. That's what it felt like.
Nice. No, that's a good revelation, because you're in an unnatural state being in a body. So we're in this kind of weird and anxious place because we're engaging in a thought experiment of separation where like you're over here, I'm over there. You're in an unnatural state. You're not liberated like your spirit state like you experienced. So it's, it can be a bummer being in a body. So that's why it's good to have these experiences and move in that direction. And to address like people who have dogmatic beliefs, we've all had dogmatic beliefs. We probably, still have some, and then we don't even notice it. I just like everybody's in a developmental hierarchy. And so if you see somebody in the dogmatic and the blah, 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 the way I like to view it is like, that's a protection system for their ego, because they'd have a nervous breakdown. If they actually saw the truth, it would like shatter the illusion they put together that they think is the thing that's holding them together, allowing them to go to work every day or just deal with the difficulties of life. So I don't like to push in, but I would recommend, like if you're in that state, to kind of allow people, because the more vigorous you are about pointing out people's flaws and their dogmatism, the more you're doing it to yourself and imprisoning yourself. So it's like, okay, we don't agree. That's fine. In 10 to 20 years, somebody who's like really dogmatic may end up being like a great spiritual teacher, but they had to developmentally move through these difficult metabolisms while being in a body and while dealing with all these complex realities. So I try not to, because I've been that person too. Yeah. I've been dogmatic. I've run my mouth. I've been a know-it-all. And I wouldn't want to be in the room with myself from 15 years ago. I would throw me out the window. So I try to view it as just like, and debate's unhealthy sometimes. It's just like, have a nice day sometimes is the right approach.
Exactly.
Because it's like politics. You get in there and it's like nobody really wants to learn anything, or a lot of people don't. So, but anyways, I view that as like an ego protection, technique.
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in what you just said, and that comes with years of experience for sure. But yeah, there's days where I just want to like share that from a rooftop with a lot of my friends and people close to me that I want them to have the same experience. But to your point, there's been some people that I really care about where I want that so badly for them, that revelation and that liberation from them, because they're really entrenched in these dogmatic beliefs that I think are wrong. But I try to be gentle with them, and I hold back because, to your point, I think it would shatter them. I don't think they're at a place yet in their life, not because they're ignorant or dumb, but just because they need that security or that strongly held belief to literally hold them together. It's like a crutch. Maybe, I do hope that one day they'll get there, but right now they're not ready for it. I was that person for a lot of years. I wasn't ready for it, and only in the last couple of years I've gotten to, I think, that maturity level where I have been ready for it. And I wouldn't even call it a maturity level, to be honest with you. I don't feel like I'm anywhere near where I need to be. I got to a point where I was willing to accept that I didn't have all the answers, and that was the push I needed. But yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in what you said, because it's not everybody's not ready for it tomorrow. You got to be prepared. But anyway,
no, and yeah, that's a great
Yeah, I was just going to cut in for a second. That's good insight by you, because that's everybody's response is like, oh, like my father's dealing with so much difficulty, or my friend is a mess, and he would do great with this. And what you're pointing to is, say, like that heartfelt, expansive experience you're having. But it's like, no, that person wouldn't do well. This person have a fucking nervous breakdown because they are so enmeshed in a poisonous way of thinking. They haven't worked through the developmental steps. So you want to share. It's like you're a successful drug dealer when you start out and you make a ton of money and you start giving money to the poor and you feel like, you know, everything's great until the cops are in your house, you know. It's like you have this benevolent impulse, but the more you do it, you'll reel it in and you'll realize that it's done at the level of the mind, because there is only one mind that has conjured up the universe of time and space. And if you could do your part to heal it, you are healing the entire mind by forgiving, by not judging, you know, that not just going out in the world and moving around figures on the screen, but healing not your brain, the mind outside of time and space that has created this distortion and the negative things here too. You heal that, you know, through ceremonies, right? Where you see this ancestral lineage of like child abuse or ethnic war or something, and you actually can see the lineage and heal that part of it. So that is much more powerful than going and telling your buddy a bunch of shit they don't want to hear, if you know what I'm saying, you know? Or they're not ready for, you know?
Yeah. Damn. Yeah. Man, I could talk to you about that all night, but let's shift gears back to something else. You mentioned, you know, plate tectonic theory. I was wondering, not directly in regards to tectonics, I would be curious to know, you know, what you think a better theory is. But two, what do you think about Hollow Earth theory, like Admiral Byrd and, you know, others in terms of what they said about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of sources like Madame Blavatsky, the Theosophist, talked about the Hollow Earth. You know, even Casey talked about that too, and a lot of mystics, more like a cavernous Earth. Russian scientists a couple of years back, they drilled the largest or the deepest hole in history, and they ran into a ton of water, and they had all these temperature problems, and basically they basically rewrote the history of like plate tectonics and the Earth's crust and what's really going on there, but it really hasn't cut up with a lot of steam because, you know, if you're a tenured professor teaching for 30, 40 years and you've been entrenched in this way of thinking, you're not too fired up to like, you know, you see this in human origins and evolution as well. You know, my point is that there are a lot of smoking guns out there that tell us that plate tectonics is inaccurate. And in fact, there's something going on in the Earth. And I would say, you know, the Admiral Byrd thing, I don't know if I buy the fake diary thing. And I know he was down in the South Pole at Operation High Jump. But, you know, that could be just like ancient aliens doing an episode and like just telling a good story. You know what I mean? But more to the point, I think that there are oral traditions of beings like Lemurians and Mount Shasta and beings living in the Earth. And we know that, you know, life can live in these different places. And one of the things I've come to believe in is actually interdimensional realities as well, like these beings that interface with our three-dimensional reality, like all these strange cryptids. And, you know, I think there's a reality there, even Bigfoot. Yeah. You know, because some redneck has a fake Bigfoot in his freezer and he gets busted. It doesn't mean that this hasn't been part of, like, oral traditions around the world in the Himalayas and everywhere for thousands of years. There's a story there, and the skeptic points out the most ridiculous example as a refutation of the whole genre, which is once again, it's moving the goalposts and arguing in bad faith. So I'm open to these ideas. I feel like all these, you know, there's one holographic mind that is shared. So these themes that are persistent, like Hollow Earth and these strange creatures and lost worlds, there's something to it. We may not have all the dates and the facts right yet, but there is something in these stories, and you know, we'll see in the future that the strange ideas about the past will be more readily accepted.
Yeah, the cavernous Earth idea makes more sense to me, just based on what I've read and the little bit I understand of ancient history. Herodotus wrote about, you know, these peoples living in what now would be like modern day Ukraine or even Russia, talking about people living in the mountains up there who had underground dwellings. He called them the Hyperboreans. Yeah. And apparently these people went underground and had settlements underground. So to me that would definitely be more plausible than the idea of the whole Earth being hollow, but it makes you wonder what else is going on. Because, I mean, he also talked about the one-eyed Arimaspians, which is basically this Cyclops type humanoid, and he said they had underground dwellings too. So, I mean, you still get Yeti sightings in the Himalayas and things like that. And it makes you wonder what the hell's really going on and whether we're looking in all the wrong places for these things. I mean, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the red-haired giant Native American lore and all that. And, you know, people say that those things still exist and that there's underground civilizations we know nothing about. Some of that sounds like really conspiracy-minded and kind of woo-woo to me, but some of it, I don't discredit all of it. I'll just say that because, I mean, there's so much shit we haven't explored, especially in the seas, but also on land in certain places. Do you take any of that stuff seriously? I mean, obviously the ancient Native American lore around red-haired giants sounds credible, but in terms of modern day sightings, quote unquote, you think any of that's legitimate?
Yeah, I've heard stories of the Kandahar giant. My buddy L.A. Marzulli interviewed these special forces guys who claimed to kill this red-haired giant with 6 fingers and 6 toes.
Yeah.
Brought it to like Bagram Air Force Base. The Solomon Islands, there's stories of underground dwellings and giants. I just think we're a whacked-out species with PTSD that is like primarily focused on survival or getting or biology. And there is a small minority that is very spiritually advanced, and there's a lot of people who are out to lunch, and that's not a diss. I just think as a species, we're very limited in our awareness, and I think there's all kinds of extraterrestrial, interdimensional, and multidimensional interactions that are happening in the quadrant of time and space that we're existing in, and I just think, you know, the universe of time and space is a freak show. It's a world of duality, or it's a universe of duality. You have all kinds of potentials and outcomes and different things going on. And I'd say be open to it. You know, I could do a 1-hour lecture and show like statues and rock art in virtually like isolated Pacific islands, Easter Island, Hawaii, Australia, almost every U.S. state, almost every country in the world that shows 6 fingers and 6 toes, yep, where the footprints or the handprints are much larger than the regular ones. And then there's a passage in the Bible about the giant of Gath having 6 digits, 6 toes and 6 fingers. My point is that doesn't even get looked at by science, but the entire world is screaming out, like in the ancient world has chronicled this event in the most specific way in the most isolated locations around the globe. So there's a story here, and our science is so atheistic and anti-spiritual and cult-like, they don't entertain it, and they mock, you know, it's like Bill Nye the Science Guy, you're an idiot or whatever. And there's this arrogance to science that it's its own cult. And the thing about a cult is you don't realize you're in a cult when you're in a fucking cult. So yeah. And once again, it's not a diss. I'm glad I can get my appendix taken out by my doctor. But like, my doctor's not going to tell me to like drink wheatgrass juice and go meditate. He's going to give me a fistful of pills from fucking Pfizer or something. Yep. And that's just the way it is. And so it's like there's a limited, or there are. I view the whole thing as look at all these different disciplines in a holographic, holistic way, like holistic archaeology, and that includes Edgar Cayce and mystics. See what they say in common and see if you can verify what they say. Like Cayce said a bunch of stuff that was not revealed until a couple of years after his death, and the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So there's all these ways to verify this shit. Yeah. And I understand a lot of this sounds weird, but I just, you know, I'm like you. I have an open mind to it.
You know, my thing, here's one area of skepticism for me. I believe humans are really shitty at keeping secrets, and I don't think that if these things were as prevalent as, you know, the record would seem to indicate that they are, that everybody'd be able to keep it quiet, or at least quiet enough that nobody takes it seriously. I mean, I could be wrong. People are generally apathetic, so they just don't really care. I mean, they're on to the next thing in 5 minutes. A credible UFO sighting comes out 10 minutes later. You're already moving on to the next thing. But for people like you and I, who are a little more interested and more likely to stick around when these things do break into the news, it just seemed like somebody would have let the cat out of the bag. Like the UFO thing, for example, you get guys like Bob Lazar who come out, and I do think he's credible, and I think there are others too. But, you know, in the space around giants and things like that, you would think, at least I would think, that more people would be sounding the alarm than just like the L.A. Marzulis and Steve Quayles of the world. And maybe they are. I don't know. You used to talk about all these sightings in newspapers in the 1800s, and then all these giants just disappeared. So, like, I don't know, man. Like, what the hell's going on? Is this a massive cover-up, or are people just not paying attention?
I don't believe in, like, academic cover-ups. See, an academic views it as like, okay, it's either we're being told we're covering up all this information or we're incompetent. And I don't believe either is true. I just think you establish a paradigm, and that's very tough to change. And a perfect example is like the Clovis Barry, the idea that nobody was in the Americas before about 13,000 years ago. And that held for like 90 years, and it was dogmatically defended. And now in the last 20 years, there's like 15, 20 different sites that go back like 20, 25,000 years, which shatters that. Yeah. Out of Africa, they've just found a 210,000-year-old skull in Greece. On and on and on. There have been finds that have shattered one of the longest-held theories and the golden calves of anthropology out of Africa. That's in the shitter now, too. The idea that there was never a cataclysmic flood and a giant cataclysm has been shattered as well. Virtually everything that science has held true and dare for the last 100 years has been turned upside down the last 20 or 30 years, finding Göbekli Tepe, on and on and on. The point is, and finding hobbits in Indonesia and Denisovans who had giant teeth and jaws in Siberia. They look like they might have been 8 or 9 feet tall. We don't have any long bones yet. My point is that science is just slow to change, and it's human nature and agenda. There's weird shit that goes on in the world, but in academia, it's kind of like medical science. It's just like, don't kill the golden calf. These things will change eventually, but it just takes a long time. Yeah. So guys like us, we're called like weirdos and lunatics, and eventually we'll be considered like reasonable alternative theorists or something like that when these things fully change. And you just got to stick with it and get some thick skin, because that's just the nature of human nature is very slow to react and change. Yeah.
This guy one of my listeners to my podcast sent me a link to something a few weeks ago about the Egyptian pyramids, and like all these facts that get overlooked about being on the same latitudinal line as like some of the pyramids in the Americas or the ziggurats, astrological alignments with like the stars in the belt of Orion. I mean, there's so much more going on back in the construction of some of these ancient relics and monuments than we know. And I know, people know some of these talking points, but it just seems like it's like human history is like a 200 chapter book, and we've got like the last 2 chapters, and like the first 198 chapters, we've got nothing except for like a few words here and there. And those words are basically like these monuments that are left, like Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids, the ziggurats, and that's it. That's all we know about the first 198 chapters of the book, man. And it's kind of frustrating because you're trying to piece together this narrative, but like everything's missing.
Catastrophobia. It's collective PTSD as a species. We basically got thrown back to zero about 13,000 years ago. Edgar Cayce, in fact, said the Great Pyramid of Giza was not built in 2750 BC like Egyptologists tell us, but between 10,400 BC and 10,300 BC as a tool of initiation. And Jesus, one of his incarnations as Hermes, or Thoth, and Edgar Cayce was Ra-Ta, and they incarnated, and they were the grand creators and architects over a 100-year span in 10,430 BC to create it. That's what Cayce says. Oh, wow. So you have these ancient monuments, and he also says that like Pumapunku, Sacsayhuaman, all these crazy temples in Central America and South America were built by Atlantean colonists as well. Because I've been there as a stonemason looking at Pumapunku and Ollantaytambo, and it's just like, you can't get a micron between those seams. It looks like the stones were melted. And Cayce specifically states that light and sound and levitation technology was used to create these. And when the Spanish showed up at Tiwanaku and Sacsayhuaman and other places, they were specifically told that the Viracochas and the giants and these supernatural beings did all the stonework. They didn't say they did it. The Incas specifically stated that. And then it's falsely attributed because that doesn't fit the timeline of modern academia. So is it a conspiracy? No, it's just like kind of lazy, half-assed science that doesn't listen to oral tradition. So once again, I go back to the shamans, I go back to the ceremonial wisdom keepers, I go back to the mystical sources that are not invested and a stupid ego and petty agendas and a temporary life, but to something much larger to get my answers through comparative analysis. And I think that's a wise thing that will stand the test of time. And guys like Plato or Herodotus or Berosus, like chroniclers who had a lot of integrity, I also read through all their literature as well.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, phew, I could talk about a million things, but we'll wrap it up here in a second. One last thing I wanted to touch on was Casey. A lot of what you said about Edgar Casey sounds similar to some of the early Christian mystics that came before him. I don't know if you're familiar with John Dee, but he basically sat in the court of Queen Elizabeth in Britain in the 16th century. And this guy was a Christian mystic. He did like scrying and like the whole idea of like the looking glass or the crystal ball. That imagery kind of comes from the work he did. But this guy, he was really into some weird stuff, but he basically he did automatic he did like automatic writing and stuff, and he had some weird visions about the future and the past, but similar stuff, like about these like beings coming to Earth and basically, you know, incarnating wisdom and whatnot. But he talks about at one point about sound technology, which is interesting to me because I've heard this before. The people of Easter Island, where the big Moai heads are, and a lot of people still go see them as a tourist site. The ancient tradition there is that the Moai once walked, and apparently it was to the sound of music. Go figure. So like there was a certain musical or frequency, a sound frequency, I'd probably say music, that caused these things to move. And they say that this is lost technology that we no longer have. It's interesting because there's also UFO sightings where people talk about these things emitting strange sounds, and they'll have like hieroglyphics or weird designs on the sides of the craft. And to me, that seems like there's some sort of parallel there. Like there's some sort of technology, and it might even tie into Atlantis and, you know, Lemuria and other ancient civilizations. But this idea of sound technology seems to be key. A good buddy of mine who's a musician kind of talks about this, and I think there's a whole language there around mathematics and sound that is just an untapped reservoir of what we would call magic, but it's really just, you know, science and technology.
Yes, it's called Enchantment of the Landscape. John Michel was my buddy Hugh Newman's mentor, and he was a pioneer in the geomantic arts. Now, once again, all around the globe, these survivors taught an ancient alchemy of geometry, mathematics, sound dynamics, and earth energies to create sacred spaces. So when you look at Stonehenge, there's just a recent article about the acoustics of Stonehenge, or the Hypogeum in Malta, or all these places around the world, all these temple sites. There are all these different factors. Like the archaeologists will dig in the dirt, they'll find some pottery, they'll find some artifacts, they'll try to carbon date it, they'll ignore the oral history of the people, and they'll create this kind of really sterile version of what happened. But these were tools of enlightenment that were created all around the world. That's why Casey encouraged, go to the Great Pyramid, go to these ancient sites in Peru, visit these vortexes, because it will help awaken your consciousness, because these ancient magicians who showed up after the flood and survived, they taught mathematics, geometry, earth energy, and that geometric science that basically would, if you were paying attention, you would get a much more advanced picture of the things you're talking about. And John Dee, once again, I've studied him extensively, and Edward Kelly was his assistant, and Kelly was like a hardcore conservative Christian. And when Dee started, they started seeing angels and talking about reincarnation, he started to get freaked out. It's really just like Casey. It's like these guys were like oriented to traditional Christian ways, and then they got their paradigms blown apart by these angelic beings showing up. But to your point, yes, there's an ancient science that actually I'm writing about right now with Hugh in our book of, the ancient survivors and giants of the British Isles. We're writing a book telling that story like we did in the Americas. And it's a similar story that basically describes an ancient science that was lost, that made crops grow better, that helped people become enlightened, that created peace and stability in society. And now we got like parking lots in Walmart. I mean, we've descended into a real dark place, that is hopefully rising up. But you can see what happens when humans get their head up their ass, Yeah.
Well, we're coming up on an hour, man. I don't want to eat up too much of your time, but every time I talk to you, I feel like an hour flies by and like 10 minutes is what it feels like, man. But Yeah, we'll have to stay in touch and definitely do this again sometime. But in the meantime, where can people keep up with you and your work?
Yeah, I'm doing the Awake and Empowered Expo next month in Detroit. That it's on Facebook, or I'm sure it's on. You could just Google it. I think it's August 11th to the 13th. Ethan Fox puts it on. It's a really cool, open-minded. It's spiritual and metaphysical ancient mysteries conference. I'm doing a tour with Hugh and Yusuf Awan, who's a stonemason from Egypt who understands the oral traditions there. And we're doing an ancient Egypt tour at the end of November, and we're going to Petra, Jordan as an add-on. So it's like a 3-week tour. If you're interested in that, go to megalithomania.com. That'll be a really cool tour. I've done some, I was on Megan Fox's show, I think, last time we talked, and I've done a couple other spots on new shows on travel on the Science Channel. One is Code of the Wild, about the lost city of Ecuador, and the other is a Templar mystery I did for a new show, Uncharted, on the Science Channel. So I continue to do, appearances in different shows and speak at conferences. And I'm on Facebook, but Megalithomania is a good place to, because Hugh and I do a bunch of stuff together, like tours and conferences. Like if you're in London, the Origins conference is November 11th, and Andrew Collins speaks there, and I do, and Hugh. So that's a really cool conference. But lots of interesting stuff going on in the world of ancient mysteries. So I get a bunch of videos online too. Like if you go to my timeline on Facebook, I did like 10 videos in London recently about Edgar Cayce. And if you're interested, I'll show like 400 slides and do an hour presentation where I go through all the stuff we were just talking about, but give this visual evidence and the specific quotes of all the sources. So it's a really compelling, like if you're open to it, I think you'll walk away getting a good glimpse of the story that's being told. Because as we talk about it, it can sound interesting, but it's like, I want to see 100 pictures of freaks with man bags. I just don't want to listen to this. You know what I'm saying? So, so other than that, everything's cool, and I appreciate you having me on.
Awesome. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. We've got some listeners in the UK, so you guys, if you catch this episode, go catch Jim and Hugh while they're out there. And yeah, man, I might want to get in on one of these tours that you're doing. That one in November sounds like a trip. So yeah, I'll share a link to I'll get a link on your website, and I'll put it in the show notes for everybody who's interested. But yeah, it's been a pleasure, Jim. Thanks for fitting us into your busy schedule, and we'll definitely circle back soon, my brother.
All right, man. Nice to see you, Josh. And yeah, let's stay in touch and keep communicating. And I'll come back on, or we'll meet in the in the other realm or something like that.
One of these days, man.
And I think that's what's important, those questions about why the fuck are we here, what's the nature of time and space, those things to me are important. Everything else is kind of spinning its wheels,